Good morning, 7 East. Happy Tuesday, people. It's Mr. LEPRE here on this Tuesday episode of Free LEPRE Radio. Thank you all for those who filled out that survey assignment. It's not due till Sunday, but many of you filled it out. I had nearly half the grade fill it out, which is awesome. That's going to help me going forward. Thank you for that. We are live-ish on the air. And today's show would be very helpful for you to finish that second assignment. In this episode today, let's look at our agendas. We're going to mainly talk about the Washington administration and how to take notes and how to judge or grade presidents. So the first thing is just going over how we judge presidents. Then I'm going to give in the specifics of the Washington administration. You already have the slides I'm going to go over with you for that. You can use those slides as a guide for how to take notes when you do the Adams administration notes, which is the assignment or the second assignment of the week. And then finally, popular segment, Weird News. 3 weird news stories, true news stories that I found that you might find interesting, shocking, hilarious, or otherwise. So let's get right into it. With it being Tuesday, just so we know, this is where we are in my mock calendar for the week. So if you did the end of unit questionnaire, thank you. If not, make sure you do it. And this is where we are today. No new assignment, but I'm going over George Washington and the notes. So our big question for Unit 6. How do we judge or grade presidents on whether they did a good job or bad job? It seems everyone can have an opinion on this, no matter what president we're talking about. But what are we basing this opinion on when we say a president was a good president or a bad president? That's what I want us to think about. So, a common way to figure out if someone's good or bad at something, well, just figure out what the description of that thing is. A bad coach in a sport is probably a coach that does not have a team that can win a lot. So maybe that's a part of the job description for a coach, making sure that you're actually putting together a winning team. Well, what is the job description for the president? Well, the Constitution in Article 2 has a very short job description. And it's in the oath of office. So the president, all they're expected to do is to faithfully execute the office of president. That means they are supposed to do all the stuff the president is supposed to do, like it says in the Constitution, and preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Seems very basic, and on this description alone, it is very hard to judge a president, because we don't really even think about what presidents do in this way. We think of it in a more holistic way. And for that reason, we don't grade presidents solely on that job description. Generally, we focus on another big question, and that's this. Was the United States better off or worse off after a president's time in office? That is generally how we grade or judge our presidents. If America is better off after their time in office, we generally say they were a good president, they did a good job. If America is worse off, we tend to say it is a bad president. So here's some extreme examples I'm going to show you. What some people might call the worst president in the history of the United States of America, James Buchanan. I guess many historians probably give him the grade of an F. So if we're grading him on the school letter grade metrics. Why would he get an F? Well, because the country literally broke apart under his presidency and stopped being United States of America. And the country fell into the Civil War. So he is the president in office when several of the states leave the country, and then we have the Civil War start. So you can't really get much worse than that. If you're there to protect the United States, and the United States breaks apart under your watch, can't really help you with that one. That's an F, and there's no extra credit or test corrections that I can get him back from that. So I would say many historians probably would say James Buchanan, probably one of the worst, getting a grade of F. Now, on the flip side of this, the president right after him, probably one of the most revered presidents, and gets the highest grades from historians. Abraham Lincoln, president from 1861 to 1865. Many historians give him an A+. Why? Because he brought the country back together, winning the Civil War, reuniting America, and making sure the U.S. Constitution was preserved and saved in the process, even though he had to do a lot of stuff that a lot of people disagree with to get it done. So that's you see the two ends of the grading spectrum, F and A+. And I think you'd find that all of our presidents will fall somewhere between those two. So for example, let's talk about more in the modern sense. But before I go any further, let's just be clear about this. A president usually gets judged based on how they handle a few big events or issues that happen during or as a result of their presidency. No one is keeping a daily tracking of what the president's rating is. Well, we do that, but it doesn't really mean anything. How people think the president does every day. It's more about how does a president handle the big events that happen when they're president. So, for example, if we were to look at the presidency of George W. Bush, these are probably the four biggest events that he had to deal with. 9/11 terrorist attacks, the war on terror in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and the 2008 financial crisis. These four things, if anyone's writing a history book about George W. Bush's presidency, it's kind of focused on these four things. Other things as well, like Hurricane Katrina, but these four are pretty much how they're going to grade his presidency. How did he respond? How did he handle these situations? And we do this for every single president. You will find a handful of issues that a president is graded and judged on. And now these events or issues get divided into two main categories. You have a president's domestic policy, and domestic policy is the stuff the president does inside the United States. And a president's foreign policy is the stuff the president does outside the United States in America's relationship with other countries. And we're about to see how the division works out in our very first presidency with the Washington administration. So if a president is seen to have handled major events that occurred during their administration well, then history usually gives them a good grade, and they are remembered as a good president. And just as a note, when we use the word administration for presidents, like when we say the Bush administration, the Trump administration, the Washington administration, we use it to mean basically their entire team. So the entire administration is the president, vice president, the cabinet, the advisors, everybody involved in the president's decision making. So now we're going to go right to those Washington administration notes. You already have the slideshow, which is a part of Monday's materials, but I'm going to comment and narrate it as I read through it. So I'm going to X out my presentation, go to the Washington administration, and starting right from the beginning. So we have the Washington administration, President George Washington. Our first presidential election. It's a very interesting story. I didn't go too much into it, but I'll make some comments on what was weird about it. So George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States in the election of 1788. It took a while back then. Everything wasn't done in one day, so it kind of stretched into 1789. George Washington had no political party. He was against the idea of having political parties anyway. On the other hand, Washington's vice president, John Adams, would become a leading member of the Federalist Party. So an interesting fact about this election is that there was actually somebody behind the scenes who was trying to make sure that Washington got a unanimous vote and didn't have any opposition, and that person was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton realized that there was a flaw in the Constitution, that, remember, this is before you had a separate vote for president and vice president, where a second place winner would become vice president, and Hamilton was afraid that electors might only vote once for Washington and then give someone else an equal number of votes, which meant that the presidential race would not be decided with a clear winner, meaning you'd have one candidate, Washington, with an amount of votes, and another candidate with the same amount of votes. He wanted to make sure Washington won and won big, and for that he tried to push people away from voting for John Adams at all, and John Adams later found out about this and got really upset because he thought that people didn't like him because he got less votes. But regardless, he still had the second place number of votes and became vice president. So the election map back then, much smaller. A few states did not participate. So I believe Rhode Island and North Carolina had not ratified the Constitution yet. So they did not participate. In New York's delegates, I think New York did not send delegates for some reason. I don't know exactly why. But it was unanimous regardless. Washington wins all the states. So here are the problems that were facing President Washington when he first came into office. Number one, he's the first to run a new government without an example to follow. That's probably one of the biggest challenges. Two, the United States still had a ton of debt to pay back from the Revolutionary War, over $1 billion in today's money. Three, there were conflicts between Native Americans and settlers moving west into lands won from Britain in the Revolutionary War. Remember, America got all that land west of the Appalachian Mountains, and now settlers are moving west. Now, four, interesting, this is going to play a role in most of the presidents we talk about this week and next week. French Revolution threatens to break the U.S.-France alliance, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So domestic policy. This is stuff going on inside the United States. We're going to focus on that first. So setting up the executive branch and judiciary. When Washington was elected with Adams as vice president, there were no other offices in the executive branch, and Washington had to create and fill all of them. So it's in purple here, meaning if I was giving this to you in class, you would abbreviate these and take notes. When you see the Adams slides, same thing will appear, but for this one today, you don't got to take notes. I've given you my notes. So Washington set up 3 departments with secretaries to advise him. He had the Treasury Department, Hamilton, he put in charge. Secretary of State, Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, he put in charge. That's doing with other countries. And Secretary of War, he put Henry Knox, that guy who dragged that cannon from Boston. He got put in charge of the War Department. And the secretaries, Attorney General, and Vice President, those who surrounded the president, came to be known as the President's Cabinet. A word that does not appear in the Constitution, but it's an intricate part of our government. It's part of our unwritten Constitution. The president has this group of advisors around him or her that helps them make decisions. And here we have Henry Knox, from left to right, Hamilton, and Jefferson. So since the president had the power to appoint justices to the Supreme Court and other posts, Washington had to fill these spots from scratch. Supreme Court was set up, but there were no judges on it. So Washington passed the Judiciary Act of 1789 that the Congress drafted, and he set up a Supreme Court with 6 justices. I don't know why they picked 6. They should have chosen an odd number, but they started with 6. Now we have 9 today. But John Jay was named the Chief Justice. So other federal courts were also set up to hear appeals from the state courts. And here is John Jay. I don't know why he has this orange robe. It's like Halloween colors. But he's got style. Hamilton's financial plan, the next big thing of domestic policy. So at this point, America owed $52 million to countries that helped America financially during the war. Over $1 billion today, as I mentioned. Countries like France and the Netherlands that lent us money and expected to get paid back. So after Washington appointed Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton came up with a plan to help America get out of debt and improve the U.S. economy. Here we have a picture of Hamilton. So Hamilton's plan had 3 parts to help pay back the $52 million war debt. Number 1, the U.S. government agreed to pay all debts from the Revolutionary War, including those for each state. This was big. If you ever loaned money to somebody and they never pay you back, you're probably not going to loan it to them again. So Hamilton wanted to make sure America had a good reputation for handling money. This is why he wanted to make sure we pay the debts first, which means countries will trust us to loan us more money in the future. That was number 1. 2, the U.S. government would create a national bank for managing government funds. There's nothing about a national bank mentioned in the Constitution. And it was a big debate over whether the U.S. was allowed to actually make a national bank. But Hamilton thought it was necessary. So making a national bank was part of his plan. And 3rd, the U.S. government would adopt a high tax on goods coming into the country to raise money. So to try to actually raise this money, goods that are being shipped in from other countries, put a tax on them. So if you're buying a $50 crate of tea, they might put a tax on it that makes it cost $55. You take that extra $5, that goes to the national bank, and over time you raise money that could pay back a debt. And if you didn't know this, $10 bill has Hamilton's face on it because of his contributions to our economy, and as a founding father, he gets his face put on the $10 bill. Whiskey Rebellion. So Washington faced his first big test as president when unrest broke out over Hamilton's financial plan. So taxes, as we know, are never popular, one of the main reasons for the American Revolution, but the tax on whiskey angered a lot of farmers who sold whiskey for money, and they rebelled against the government over this. And here we have a picture of some of these farmers with their weapons. So in response, George Washington, he knew that he could not allow the Constitution to be kind of treated the way the Articles of Confederation were. So he organized a force of 13,000 soldiers to stop the rebellion. But the rebels gave up and ran away before any fighting. And Washington, of course, being the nice guy he was, forgave the leaders. And this whole event showed that the new government was powerful and wouldn't tolerate rebellion against an elected government. So I want us to compare this to what we did earlier in the year with Shays' Rebellion. So remember in the Articles of Confederation how they had really no way to deal with Shays' Rebellion, kind of that thing in Massachusetts that was like the Purge, where these guys weren't getting paid and just went on a rampage and tried to overthrow the state government. Well, it gets tried again with the Whiskey Rebellion, and the rebellion fails because the government is much stronger under the Constitution, and this convinced people the Constitution was better. And here we have Washington on his horse riding out. I believe he's the only president to actually go out in a general's uniform during some event in office. Now we go to the foreign policy. This is stuff that America is dealing with countries on the outside, not stuff going inside America, stuff going on outside America. So relationships with Native American tribes. So American settlers were moving west, and they were getting into constant fights with Native Americans living west of the original 13 states. And a key battle during this was the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, and that was a U.S. government victory that broke the hold Native Americans had on the old Northwest Territory, which is around where Ohio is today. Here we have a painting. You can already see some of the changes in the American Army uniform, the hats as well. And in 1795, the Treaty of Greenville caused Native Americans tribes to give up most of the land from the Ohio River to Lake Erie, so it's most of modern-day Ohio, and you can see the treaty line. We grouped the relations with Native American tribes under foreign policy because at this time, Native American tribes were seen kind of like as a foreign country. That is why you had presidents signing treaties with these tribes, even though a lot of Native Americans did live within the United States itself. And of course, if you are abbreviating this, which you should be in your notes, when we do the Adams part, I've given you mine as an example for today, you would of course shorten this if we were doing notes, but we're not. Relations with France and Britain is probably the biggest one. The biggest foreign policy issue Washington had to deal with during his presidency was more drama being stirred up between France and Britain. Renewed conflict between the countries was caused by the French Revolution, which turned France from a monarchy to a republic and then later on a dictatorship and empire. So America had a revolution, and America became a country, or colonies ruled by a king, to now being a republic, a democracy. France had a similar thing not too long after. So the French Revolution began in 1789, and it divided America. Federalists were against it because of the crazy high levels of violence. The Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans as they were called, were for it because it was a democratic revolution against a king. And of course, on the right, probably the biggest or the most well-known symbol of the French Revolution, the guillotine. One of the reasons the Federalists were against it, the main reason, was because there was a lot of violence. You had over 30,000 people in Paris alone getting executed in the guillotine. You even had the King and Queen of France getting the guillotine as well. And I believe that's what this picture is. That's King Louis XVI off with his head, that whole thing. And the Federalists were shocked by this. They didn't think that this was in the same spirit as the American Revolution. They thought this was more about just terrorizing people, so they were against it. But on the other hand, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, thought this was a good thing. Some bad stuff was happening, but in the end it would be a good thing because you would have a monarchy replaced by a democracy. So the French revolutionaries executed the king and queen in 1793. This terrified Britain and other European countries because they were afraid revolutions like the one in the American colonies and the one in France would spread and lead to the overthrow of monarchies everywhere. Most of the major countries in Europe declared war on France to stop their revolution. And in 1793, Britain and France went to war as part of this, and there was a debate over who the United States should join. The Democratic Republicans wanted to join France, Federalists wanted to join Britain, but Washington wanted to stay neutral, not choose a side. And here on the right, you see that pretty much every major country in Europe declared war on France to try to stop their revolution. France against the world, and France wins this one. And even though this event kept going and the drama never stopped, in 1795, the United States signed the Jay Treaty with Britain, which kept America neutral, but slightly favored Britain over France in the war. This, as you can imagine, angers France and the Republicans in America. They believed the treaty was unequal and favored Britain at the expense of both America and France, who the U.S. had a treaty with also. And if you're wondering about that treaty America had with France and our alliance in the Revolutionary War, well, America kind of ignored its earlier treaty with France because people like Hamilton, who was a Federalist, argued that the treaty that America made with France was made with the king, King Louis XVI, and that since Louis was killed by his own people and replaced with a new government, America did not have to abide by this agreement anymore, that it was pretty much over. And here we have a picture of what the text of the Jay Treaty looked like. And then Washington gets reelected in 1792 unanimously. John Adams stays on as vice president. And as you can see, compared to the earlier map, new states were added at this time. and new states will be continue to be added. New York finally gets its act together. North Carolina has ratified the Constitution, and Rhode Island has as well. And then at the end of all this, after 2 terms, Washington decided to retire from politics after his 2nd term. He sets the example that presidents should really only serve for 2 terms before moving on. This sets up 2 of his closest advisors, Vice President John Adams and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, to run against each other in the election of 1796. And we'll cover that tomorrow. And it starts to get ugly. But that 2-term tradition was pretty much kept all the way until the 20th century. And now it is an amendment that a president cannot serve for more than 2 terms. But Washington starts that example. And of course, Washington is honored today by being on the $1 bill. If you were in our Google Meet last Friday, I showed you the hidden thing on the dollar bill where there's actually an owl hidden somewhere on the $1 bill. You can try to look for it if you can. You probably need a magnifying glass or to zoom in a lot. But there's some other cool stuff hidden in the dollar bills. Not just this one, but others as well. And that is the end of our Washington administration notes. And now I will go back to our radio show, to our last segment of the day. Just as a reminder, you didn't have to take notes on Washington. You have my notes. When we do GIMP kits, you're going to want to use those notes. But after looking at the slides today and seeing the text in purple, which means you put it in your notes, use what we did today as an example of how to do it for atoms. So read through it, look at the purple, try to abbreviate it. Now our last segment of the day. Weird news. A few good stories for you. The news always shocks me, although it shouldn't at this point. Story number 1. Story number 1. Donuts featuring Dr. Fauci's face are quickly becoming a nationwide hit. So Dr. Fauci, who you may be seeing on TV a lot, he's the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. He's kind of the expert on the coronavirus right now. Well, people are trying to celebrate him, and one of the ways they're doing that is by putting his face on a lot of stuff, including donuts. I also see that his face is being put on cupcakes and socks as well. Dr. Fauci socks. But donuts featuring Dr. Fauci's face are now for sale if you're interested. I think the place that sells them is called Donut Delight or Delight Donut. But apparently they're sending them nationwide. I don't know how edible the photos are, but I'm getting hungrier just watching my screen. I even see a bacon-themed donut in the top left of that photo. But Dr. Fauci, delicious guy. Story number 2. Magic budget folder mysteriously changes color on live TV. I saw this and I could not believe it. This was actually in the UK, and there was a video. I don't have the video up, but I have a before and after picture. And apparently there was this official in the United Kingdom, and he was walking out of a building, and the binder in his hand was red. He walks behind a car, and it's green on the other side. Is it Illuminati confirmed? I don't know, but I really have not figured out an answer to this yet. Look it up. Look up on YouTube, budget folder or binder changes color on live TV. I can't explain this. I'll try to get the footage and include it on a future broadcast, but it changes from red to green in a split second. If it's not a practical joke, then it means the Matrix is real and there was a glitch in the Matrix. But that is story number 2. And story number 3. This really could have gone in sports news, but I felt that it was good enough on weird news because it's weird enough. So, Texans player Kenny Stills, he's attacked by birds for his burrito, believe it or not. So the Houston Texans wide receiver Kenny Stills, he's out in California right now training for the season. And he was eating a burrito, apparently, at the beach. And these are his words now. He went on Twitter and he said, California beaches are closed, so this shouldn't be an issue. But if you head to the water, do not bring food, in all caps, he says. Stills continues, birds attacked me yesterday and took my burrito. Was wild how they did it, too. I literally put the bag down to get my towel situated. They swarmed the food, then had the other birds block me, so I couldn't stop them. So we wish Kenny Stills a speedy recovery, and we will remember the burrito in the in memoriam segment at the end of the NFL season. So watch your burritos, watch the skies, make sure the birds aren't taking your stuff. That is weird news. That is our last segment of the day. And this is Mr. LEPRE signing off on this 50th episode of Free LEPRE Radio. Have a good one.